still have the VTA. So thank you for coming in. Maybe you could state your names and your organisation.
Thank you. Neil Sach, CEO of the Victorian Taxi Association, and accompanied by David Samuel, who's the Executive Officer of Policy and Communications.
Thank you. So we have your submission and other things we've had from you over the inquiry. Maybe you'd like to make a general statement.
Sure. The VTA, Victorian Taxi Association, actually welcomes this opportunity to participate in this public hearing of the inquiry and discuss the VTA's response. I think it goes without saying that from the outset I'd like to publicly reaffirm the commitment of the Victoria's taxi industry to taxi driver safety. The VTA also reaffirms its commitment to meaningful and sensible reform of the Victorian taxi industry in order to improve service delivery requirements, delivery outcomes for taxi customers and taxi industry participants. The VTA has, for well over 3 years, pursued with successive governments fundamental regulatory change, particularly around taxi licensing. During the 14-month taxi industry inquiry process, the VTA has continued its call for reform by working and consulting with the community, taxi drivers, taxi operators, taxi licence holders and taxi networks to better understand their issues, needs and expectations. This work enabled the VTA to actively contribute to the inquiry through the lodgement of submissions, information papers and participation in consultation regarding specific matters. It also assisted the VTA to prepare its Pillars of Reform document. This document is a roadmap, which you've seen, is a roadmap for reform to change the taxi industry for the betterment of taxi users and taxi industry participants. VTA members and their affiliates, thanks David, at their own expense have contributed to the inquiry's work and provided the underpinning data that has been relied upon by the inquiry. The VTA continue to hold the view that the 6-week window given to the community and the industry to properly consider and respond to a draft report of nearly 600 pages and over 140 recommendations was inadequate. This was particularly so in respect of the fundamental economic basis of some recommendations which require specialist consideration and advice. The VTA has engaged the services of leading accountancy firm PwC to provide detailed economic modelling and advice. This information will be provided to the inquiry and made available on the VTA website when completed. The VTA acknowledges that many of the industry's draft recommendations are sensible. These have been stated in the VTA submission to the draft report. However, there are a number of recommendations that, if adopted, will lead to poorer outcomes for taxi users and those involved in the industry. For example, the VTA does not believe the recommendations adequately consider the negative externalities that flow to taxi customers from oversupply to the taxi market. Ultimately, effective reforms must relate directly to the problems they are attempting to address. Customers have very little interest in the structure behind the taxi service. All they want is a clean taxi that takes them safely where they want to go at an appropriate price. As has been demonstrated in many jurisdictions where open entry licensing models have been adopted, such as New Zealand, the result is oversupply rather than emergence of productive competition. In such jurisdictions, this has led to lower service standards and higher costs being borne by the customer. There is no evidence to suggest that unrestricted entry would address the issues affecting Victoria's taxi service. This is because increased supply will not address the actions, behaviours and attitudes that currently underlie the taxi consumers' concerns. In many cases, the VTA believe that increasing supply through open entry of licences will amplify the existing problems with the Victorian taxi service. The only justifications for increase in supply should be when demand is not met across the entire shift as opposed to short periods of peak times. With occupancy rates in Melbourne taxis of between 25 and 30% per shift, open entry is an unsustainable argument. The VTA is of the view that the industry's licensing recommendations and the processes suggested are outdated and do not address what appears to be the central concern, service standards rather than supply. In the past, a substantiable argument for open entry of licensing could be developed because there wasn't reliable data available to regulators to ensure that they could effectively measure demand and release licences in line with that demand when required. This is no longer the case. This data is now readily available through primary network service providers, and it is now being used in many Australian jurisdictions to inform sensible decisions regarding supplying the market with additional taxis on an annual basis. The VTA supports this approach to supply because it ensures customer demand is met. Taxi customers are not faced with issues arising from an oversupplied market, and the industry remains sustainable. The VTA has also argued that a similar process of evidence-based decision-making should be adopted for fare setting. Excuse me. Other areas of concern to the VTA include the structure of the commercial relationship between operators and drivers, the lack of attention given to improving driver safety, the introduction of new licence zones based on licence values, the introduction of minicabs, the removal of mandatory affiliation with primary network services providers, and the handling of customer complaints and queries. These are important matters. These important matters are discussed in the VTA submission to the inquiry's draft report. Finally, the VTA encourages the inquiry to take an open and consensus-based approach to developing its final recommendations. There is now an opportunity for the industry, the community and the inquiry to work together to refine the recommendations and ensure a workable set of final recommendations are developed which will deliver a high-quality taxi industry for Victoria into the future. The VTA has previously stated that the taxi industry is seeking reform and that will ensure fair outcomes for the industry while providing Victorians with the taxi industry it deserves. Importantly, the VTA remains of the view that meaningful reform can be achieved without severely and permanently damaging the lives and businesses of those who have invested in and built the industry. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. Yeah, you want to ask any? I've got a few general things, but do you want to start?
I suppose it's important to get the terminology right. It's been thrown around a fair bit today. Open entry, deregulation, etc. Neither of which were recommended by us in the draft report. We recommended continuation of restrictions on the number of licences that were issued, but we recommended simply that they were a change of form of restriction, rather than some all-wise person trying to second-guess what the quantity should be. We said that a market should decide that on the basis of a price that had been set by government for a licence lease. So I just it's important because people keep quoting the Irish experience, the New Zealand experience, etc. And people got to understand that these are totally different from what we are suggesting here. I wondered, so my question, I suppose, if you've sort of evaluated this proposal that we put for a price-based restriction on licences, and how different is it from what we've got now, in fact?
Yes, we understand the point you're making, and the draft recommendations were to provide licences to any person who believed they could operate a business at $20,000 fixed per year, which had a couple of impacts, and one was in regard to the current licences and the assignment fees related to those. And we said, and whilst the VTA has been supporting very much the capping of assignment fees, because we believe that there was the cost of that was just too high for the industry to cope with, and that it was the assignment price that really set the market price of the licence, and we were concerned that the assignment fees were coming down. But the issue that we had with that, with the proposal is probably two things. One is that the $20,000 didn't really reflect what is happening in the marketplace now. We're saying that's too low. But the other issue is that if you look at what the licence price might change to, given the fact that anybody can go along and pay $20,000 a year, and I think some of the other speakers have spoken about the $200,000 figure for a metropolitan licence, might be a bit more, might be a bit less, but that's based on the fact that those licences would still be able to attract that assignment fee in competition with government licences. So, you know, one could suggest that the $20,000, if somebody wanted a $20,000 licence and the cap in the commercial market was higher than that, people would just run off and go and enter into an agreement for a licence, a government licence. Now, if that was the case, then what you could say, well, what is the market value of a standard conventional licence if you can get one for $20,000 a year? And the view has been expressed that there is no value in that licence anymore because people would not want to buy it because they can go and get a $20,000 licence at any time they wish.
Can I also,
David,
just,
no
yeah.
value, but
Sorry?
they could sell it, couldn't they? Make it available for 20, or you know, a little under 20, and that would be of considerable value. Were you saying it would be of no value?
No value in the transfer market. Certainly in the assignment market, yes, but in the if you wanted to transfer that licence, then the question becomes who would want to buy it, because you got an option, and an option which is controlled by government really, and given that 25% of licences in Victoria are held, if you like, by government, there seems to be a sort of murkiness about that.
And I'll just add to it, David, coming back to your question about that, what's the difference between what occurs now and what you've proposed in terms of entering the market. I think that our concern, and we've discussed it in the past, comes back to bad decision making and irrational decision making, which leads to oversupply. And that's what we see as being unique in the taxi industry, is that oversupply in the market has very direct and negative effects on the consumer. If it can be avoided, I think we'd all like to avoid oversupply. I don't think anyone would advocate it's a good outcome. But coming back to your question, it's based on experience to some extent. We saw at a time a couple of years ago when the government set forth to release 530 licences in the market, a tender process put forward by government at that time. You can argue about the merits of that process in itself and the information that was provided. At the end of the day, a lot of people sought to enter the market at ridiculously high prices that weren't sustainable. Our concern is that we need to moderate the way people enter this market because it isn't a particularly difficult market to enter. Someone recently with me compared it to the telecommunications industry. It's very different. This is a labour-intensive industry, which means that it's relatively easy to enter if you have a certain amount of capital that you can use to possess it. So I think our concern isn't so much that the process you've suggested is fundamentally bad, it's the way people will respond to that process.
So isn't the answer to that yeah, I could understand the argument if we were recommending the classic economic model, which many people say we should have done, that there should just be normal entry and licences would be zero or just administrative cost. But isn't that met by having an annual fee of $20,000 plus? The person has to get a car, has to belong to a network, has to pay a driver. Wouldn't that mean that there would not be the, quote, excessive entry that you are talking about?
I don't think we've said, Alan, I think it's said excessive entry. I think that at the moment at 28% occupants we have a problem with demand, and we need to address that as an industry and in a number of ways. But I think what we're saying to you is that on face value, yeah, you know, 20 grand licence, you've got to pay a drive, you've got to buy a car, you've got to join a network, you've got to source work. In the past, in the taxi industry, that doesn't seem to have worked to actually inhibit entry. As I said, there were guys 2 years ago willing to pay $26,000, $26,800 I think, for a wheelchair accessible taxi licence, which was considerably higher than the private market value for an assignment at that time. That would, in my personal view, not represent rational behaviour in an economic sense. I can't pretend to guess why they would make that decision, I'm not them, but there was certainly a response to that market which was not rational in our view.
And I think it was alleged that there was a certain amount of misinformation which actually helped contribute to that.
As I said, yes, there was
decision.
all sorts of allegations about the process and so forth.
So I think you've said that, you know, now we've got at hand a whole lot more information where we can make decisions about, you know, new licence releases. So what would you base those decisions on?
I think you can basically develop a fairly clear set of indices, and that needs to be developed in conjunction with people like yourself and people like government regulators in terms of trying to work out what indices best represent demand for the taxi service. I think that the advantage of that approach are twofold. First and foremost is you can measure it now in terms of you can do things like airport arrivals right through to wait times to the very taxi-specific indicators, like how long are people waiting on the street on a Saturday night and a Tuesday afternoon for a taxi, and you can now measure those things. But it also allows to set, as I think Steve Armstrong mentioned before, to set benchmarks in the industry to say this is what's acceptable and this is what's unacceptable. And it's relatively simple to achieve. 10 years ago it wasn't. You couldn't do it. The IT simply wasn't there. The data wasn't there to inform that, and I think that the economists that Professor Fells just referred to as preferring that open-ended model had a very good argument 10 years ago because you couldn't adequately measure demand. You can do it very precisely now. But you would have to develop that model. We've seen it done in South Australia. They're about to roll theirs out. The ACT are doing it. New South Wales have done it for some time. Their process is probably a bit top-heavy for all of our liking, but nevertheless, there are indices there that can measure demand.
So how do you assess that they've done it very well, though? I mean,
I suppose how do you assess at open entry or less open entry or more has been done well? You do it on the basis that you take the most informed approach you can, and that is that when we've seen the most extreme examples of open entry, that hasn't worked, and we see the most extreme examples of regulated entry, like we've had in Victoria over the foreseeable past, it hasn't worked particularly well either, so we try and find a middle ground.
it's just that, I mean, whenever those sort of formula-based places have been, you know, in place, I mean, they seem to have got the answer so wrong. They don't get And the clearest manifestation of that is those places where they've removed controls already and you've had such a massive increase in numbers. I mean, that suggests to me that this sort of formula idea actually is no better at estimating what the demand should be, as is saying to someone, you make your own decision whether or not you think there's a market there for you to prosper in.
I could show you models, and I'm quite happy to do it, that measure backwards through the ACT and New South Wales that will show you that it works very well. And it hasn't been done well in the past. We all acknowledge that. We're in a situation there where we can do it better. It hasn't been trialled and run extensively anywhere in the world. The databases are now available and we can try it and move forward. That's what we're saying.
So what databases are these? What sort of things are you referring to? Because I'm trying to get an understanding of what your approach to licence.
The information that's informed your inquiry, the data that underpinned a lot of your decisions, recommendations, wasn't available 5 years ago. I mean, I note that the issue of wait times isn't heavily covered in the report in terms of being able to measure rank and hail, but the networks who collect this data and the providers of the information technology assure us that it can be. So that is the information that you can use to inform whether or not you need more taxis on an annual basis.
So it's utilisation data.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
And redundancy as well in the taxi. But I think you probably, excuse me if I get this wrong, but I think you're heading towards the question of, supply of that information, either in real time or in some formatted way. I think whilst we don't always agree within the industry, we believe that that's an essential element. And it's not just in regard to numbers of taxis, it's also part of the examining the integration of taxi services with other transport services and service types within taxis. So we think, anybody who's in a sort of policy or strategic area has got to have that information to make rational decisions about it.
So in every industry in the world, taxis is no exception and no different. Everyone wants to limit the number of people coming into the industry. And one has a lurking suspicion that if we have this formula approach, the industry will be just there year after year knocking on the door, continuing to try to limit entry. And I wonder if the time has come to actually hand that matter over to the market or to individuals to decide coming in, rather than having a bureaucracy, a government, an industry deciding who enters. That's one of my concerns about that.
And I think that that's a legitimate concern in many respects, Professor Fells. But what I would say is that as an industry and as individuals, we have a right to make our views known about something. Having said that, it shouldn't be that one person's views are more heavily considered than others. I think that we'd all like that to be the case. But that's democracy and we all have a say. But we would strongly agree with you that these processes around fare setting and licence release models need to be objective and removed as possible from political consideration and from those interests, because of that obvious concern that they can be interfered with when what you're trying to do is replicate the best of both worlds, which is a market-like relationship without the oversupply occurring that leads to a lowering of service standards and increase in price, in our view.
And just adding to that, I think the advent of this inquiry has had is a bit of a milestone in a way in terms of that sort of thinking, and as David said, we want to move away from sort of political knee-jerk type reactions in regard to both supply and price and safety and all those things that have clouded the rational decision making for many years. But I think also you cannot just flick a switch and say, as from now we've got the right answer, because these sorts of processes have to be moulded and developed, and if they don't work, you change them, and that's the nature of ongoing policy development and putting in place strategies to achieve that.
In the early 1991, the governments gave serious consideration to removing entry restrictions into various parts of the medical profession, and instead they were persuaded to have a committee made up of government and industry which set the numbers on a formula. The ratio of doctors to population should be maintained. You may have noticed there was a shortage of doctors for years afterwards. Everyone knows there's been a severe shortage, and why all the foreign doctors have come in, because that planning framework was adopted in the early 90s.
Yeah, but
Interesting.
That's what, yeah, absolutely, and that's what I'm saying in terms of decision-making points. There was a decision made at that point, but your argument is that that decision wasn't reviewed or updated, or there was a new view imposed upon that process. And that's what we're saying too. You don't get things right in such a complex policy area right all the time. You only got to look at boat arrivals to see that.
Can I ask you about licence values, because it's a very important issue? What's your position about licence values? Licence values should always go up, should never go down? What?
Our sort of position, I suppose, on licence values, particularly in the recent past, has been that our concern primarily has, because of the structure of the industry in its current state, relates to licence assignments rather than licence value, because that's where the pressure was coming upon the taxi industry, because we'd seen that move away. It's been well documented from people operating their licences and so forth, and we'd seen them move into that assignment market, if you like. And our view was that that assignment pressure was unacceptable, and that's how we formed the view that it should be capped to stop it exerting pressure. It's also our view that a lot of the licence value was based on the ability to rent the licence and seek rent for it. So we came to that position. We don't have a firm view on what should happen to licence values. I think it is ultimately an individual's choice what they pay for a licence value under this scheme. Even under your notion, there's nothing that stops someone paying more than they need to for a taxi licence. We encourage them not to. But at the same time, we don't have a firm view on what taxi licences should do, just like we don't have a view on what house prices should do. It's not something that what we think really matters. Our concern is what you do with that licence when you do hold it. And our concern particularly over the last 2 years, 3 years, has been that people have been leasing them back into the industry at high rates, which has been creating pressure down the line.
So if you cap assignments, aren't you inevitably going to have a downward impact on licence values?
Yes, we think so. We would think that because you have bought that thing and you expect a return on it, if you limit that return, then yes, we think you'll put some downward pressure on the value of the asset, particularly in the short term, I would have thought. But we've got to run a sustainable industry. Drivers have to be remunerated fairly. We have to make sure all these things can occur. At the end of the day, most licence holders I speak to, they're people who are involved in the industry and operate taxis or have operated taxis, understand that. They accept our position on that.
So if the VTA's position is that you want to cap licence value assignments, which will have a downward effect on licence values, and how far do you push that? And what's your position then on something like compensation? In terms of?
For
loss of licence value?
We don't. We've been informed by everyone who will tell us that there is no compensation payable in this situation. I'm sure we'd find out if there was a case lodged. In terms of our view, it's that everything freezes at market values now. We're not being retrospective in our approach. That's why we've put in our licence cap at $28,000.
And what impact would that have on licence values, do you think?
As I said, I'd be speculating, and I'm not prepared to do that.
I think there may be some variation, but, you know, it's just, that's business and that's decisions that are made. But what we are saying, that if somebody does buy a licence, and this relates to another aspect of assignment fees, is that we believe that if somebody purchases a licence, they should operate it.
And the 28 would be frozen, would it? Or would it be indexed?
Probably indexed in some relative terms, because it's for those who hold licences and are retired and living off that superannuation, their costs of living go up just like everybody else's.
What we don't want to see, though, is that disjoint between the licence and the business again. And that's our primary concern, is that we believe that the licence value should be a reflection of the industry's productivity and efficiency and ability to provide a good service, not as a free-floating asset that can be traded and therefore obtain value.
By the way, we heard, you mentioned, I think, the Friday night, Saturday night problem and so on. And actually we heard this morning from one of your members, Silvertop, that when there are more passengers than cars on Fridays and Saturday nights, they don't answer the phone. Do you have a view on that? Is that good practice?
I'll do that. Well, what Silvertop do is up to them, but our view on that is that it's just like waiting for a queue at the bank. There are going to be peak times and people have to understand that there are going to be delays. It's a bit like, as I use the example, it's a bit like trying to book an aircraft seat on a Friday night out of Melbourne to get to where you want to go. There's going to be peak demand inhibitors to providing that. But what we are concerned about, and somebody spoke about this earlier, is about improving the knowledge of expectation, so that, you know, it's clearly known that on a Saturday night at 11 o'clock at night, when young people are going out, that there is going to be a demand and therefore there's going to be a delay. How people run their business is up to them, but we think, you know, the community should be made aware of what the implications are.
I think also it's important to consider the use of technology in these areas where we can do it better. Telephone booking is one way to get a taxi. There's other means to get them too, and it's important that as an industry that we keep investing in those moves. So whether it be iPhone apps or internet booking, whatever it might be, any way we can alleviate demand on the phone system means you can get through quicker if you do choose to book it through a telephone number. So once again, what individual companies do is their policy and their business, but on a whole, we would encourage people to diversify in that sense. In 2012, there's options available and they should invest in them, and I think both our main metropolitan members have done that, and it's a good move.
So just on the smartphone apps, you don't have a view about whether these should be subject to regulation or not? Yes,
we do. Our view is fairly clear on this, and it comes back to customer safety and indeed driver safety to a large extent. Driver safety is fairly well managed through the current network process of them knowing where taxis are, and the GPS can follow every booking they take, whether it's a radio booking or just an off-the-street booking, and we believe that that's useful and in fact necessary. But what we are concerned about with apps is that the audit trail in terms of both it being a legitimate taxi or a legitimate public licence conveyance, and that audit trail remains in place. And that's why we don't knock having apps, but what we do want to see is apps that are either built into the network operation, as most are in Melbourne and Sydney. But there has to be a trail of accountability in terms of whether that vehicle is really a taxi.
We don't endorse trying to ban them, though. We think that's counterproductive.
Yeah.
The best way, we think, is to try and manage the evolution of the technology and do it in a way that ensures customer service and safety and driver safety at the same time.
But I didn't take from what you said that you're arguing that they should be just limited to the networks.
Well, I think technology will just override any opposition to that in the long term. We're concerned about that if somebody gets into a taxi or a vehicle that they think is a taxi or is offered to them as a taxi, then they are not being put at risk. Thank you, Dave.
Well, there's a great deal in here, and we're more concentrating on studying it in detail. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.